There's a child inside you, a child who never truly grew up. She's there right now. As you listen to this, waiting for what your parents never gave her, waiting for the promises they made and never kept, waiting for someone to finally look at her and say the words she needed to hear when she was 5, 7, 10 years old. And the most unsettling part, you might be 40, 50, 60 years old, and that child is still waiting, still believing that one day she'll receive what she desperately needs. Carl Jung discovered something that most people would rather ignore. He discovered that we don't leave our childhood behind. We carry it with us, literally, as a living part of our psyche that continues operating, feeling, desiring, exactly as it felt and desired when it was small. This wounded inner child that you carry isn't just a poetic metaphor. It's a real psychological structure. Jung called it an autonomous complex, a part of you that has its own feelings, its own reactions, its own unfulfilled needs, and until that child receives what she needs, you'll continue repeating the same patterns. You'll continue attracting the same people. You'll continue feeling that same emptiness that no external achievement can fill. In the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal exactly what your inner child has been waiting for all these years. It's not what most videos on emotional healing teach. It's not about forgiving your parents. It's not about positive affirmations in the mirror. It's something much deeper and much more specific that Jung discovered in decades of clinical work. And if you really understand this, it will change the way you relate to yourself, forever. But before I reveal what your inner child expects, I need you to understand how this wound was created. Because without understanding the architecture of the damage, any attempt at healing is superficial. Imagine a 3-year-old who's just finished a drawing. She runs to her mom, excited, holding up that paper with scribbles that, to her, represents the entire world. And the mom, tired, stressed, caught up in her own unresolved problems, glances at it quickly and says something like, "Just leave it there, I'm busy." In that moment, something happens in that child's psyche, something that Jung would call a primary narcissistic wound. The child can't process that the mum is just tired. The infantile brain doesn't have that capacity. What the child does process is a different message. I'm not important. What I do has no value. I don't deserve attention. And that message doesn't stay on the surface. It sinks. It goes to the deepest layers of the unconscious and begins to form what Jung called a complex. An autonomous psychic structure that will influence every decision, every relationship, every moment of self-evaluation for the rest of that child's life. But the real damage doesn't come from a single moment. It comes from the repetition. When that invalidation happens once, the psyche can absorb it. The problem is when it happens systematically, when the child learns, through hundreds of micro-rejections, that her feelings don't matter, that her needs are a nuisance, that she only has value when she's doing something for others. Jung observed something fascinating in his adult patients. He noticed that many of them had developed what he called a persona, a perfectly constructed social mask, while the true self, that authentic and vulnerable child, had been pushed into the shadow. And here's the part that changes everything. That child in the shadow doesn't die. She doesn't disappear. She's still there, waiting, and more than waiting. She continues influencing. Every time you sabotage yourself, every time you accept less than you deserve, every time you feel that inexplicable emptiness, even when everything in your life seems to be going well. It's the wounded child operating behind the scenes. Now, you might be thinking that you already know this, that you've already heard about the inner child. But wait, because what comes next is what most healing approaches don't understand. The wounded child inside you doesn't just want to be recognized, she wants something very specific. And until you understand exactly what it is, you'll keep trying to fill that void with the wrong things. I'm going to tell you about a woman that Jung followed for years. I'm going to call her Emily. She came to his office at 42, seemingly successful, a respected lawyer, married, 2 kids. But inside, Emily felt an emptiness that no achievement could fill. She tried everything: conventional therapies, spiritual retreats, career changes, new relationships. Nothing worked. The emptiness always came back. Jung began to investigate Emily's childhood, and what he discovered was both common and devastating. Emily's mom was what we'd call today a functional narcissist. She didn't hit, she didn't yell, she didn't physically abandon. She did something much more subtle and much more destructive. Emily's mom treated her as an extension of herself. When Emily succeeded in school, the mom would say, "See how smart my daughter is," as if Emily's intelligence was a reflection of the mom's own worth. When Emily failed at something, the mom went silent. It wasn't anger. It was worse. It was disappointment. It was a withdrawal of affection. Emily learned very early that she was only loved when she performed, only seen when she brought results. The mom's love wasn't unconditional. It was a transaction. And the price was Emily's authenticity. The child that Emily had been, that spontaneous kind of creative girl who wanted to be an artist, was slowly murdered, not physically, psychically. She was pushed into the shadow and replaced by a perfect persona, the ideal daughter, the exemplary student, the impeccable professional. And for 40 years, Emily believed that she was that persona. She forgot that there was a girl in there who was still waiting. Jung asked Emily a question that changed everything. He asked, "What did the girl you were want to be?" before she learned that she needed to be someone else. Emily froze. She didn't know how to answer. She had spent so much time being what others needed that she had completely forgotten what she herself wanted. And here's the crucial point that differentiates Jung's work from other approaches. Most inner child therapies focus on comforting, on telling the wounded child that she's loved, that she's enough, that everything will be okay. Positive affirmations, comforting visualizations. Jung saw this as insufficient, and in many cases, as counterproductive. Why? Because the wounded child doesn't just want to be comforted, she wants to be integrated. There's a huge difference between those two things: comforting and telling the wounded inner child that they are loved while they remain in the shadows. It's not enough. Integrating and bringing that child back into conscious awareness, giving them a voice, allowing them to influence your decisions consciously rather than unconsciously. That's the key. Emily's wounded inner child didn't want to just hear that she was loved. She wanted to be heard. She wanted Emily to finally pay attention to what she felt, what she wanted, what she had sacrificed to build that perfect persona. Carl Jung developed a process for this. He called it active dialogue with the shadow. And that's exactly what I'm going to describe now. But first, I need to explain why this process is so powerful and so different from anything else you've ever tried. The wounded inner child inside you isn't just a memory. It's an autonomous complex. This means it has its own patterns of thought, its own emotional reactions, its own ways of seeing the world, and it operates outside of your conscious control. When you find yourself reacting disproportionately to criticism, when you feel that desperate need for approval, when you accept treatment you know you don't deserve, that's not the adult you making those choices. So it's the wounded inner child who has taken control for a moment. Jung called this possession by the complex. Moments when the autonomous complex, in this case the wounded inner child, takes over consciousness and acts on its own. And here's the scary part. Unless this complex is integrated, it will continue doing this. It will continue sabotaging your relationships. It will continue making you accept less. It will continue creating that emptiness that no external achievement fills. The only way to stop this cycle is to do what Jung called integration work. And that starts with a simple question, but one that most people never ask. What is my inner child feeling right now? Not what it felt in childhood. What is it feeling now, at this moment? As you listen to this, Emily asked this question for the first time in Jung's office, and the answer that came surprised her completely. Emily's inner child was angry, not sad, not scared, furious for having been ignored for 40 years, furious for having been replaced by the persona, furious that Emily had spent decades trying to please people who would never love her unconditionally. And when Emily allowed that anger to be felt, something began to change. Here's what most healing approaches get completely wrong. They assume that the inner child is just vulnerable, that it only needs comfort and protection. But the wounded inner child also has anger, also has needs, also has desires that have been repressed for decades, and the real healing doesn't come from comforting that child. It comes from giving it a voice. It comes from letting it finally express what it never could express. The second question that Jung would ask was even more powerful. What does my inner child need from me now? Not what it needed from its parents. That's already past. Emily's parents were never going to change. The narcissistic mother was never going to wake up one day and say, "Daughter, I was wrong. Forgive me. You are perfect the way you are." That was never going to happen. Healing doesn't come from waiting for parents to change. Healing comes from you giving what the child needed. But here's the crucial part. You can't give what you don't know is necessary. Emily discovered that her inner child didn't need to hear that she was loved. What she needed was permission. Permission to exist. Permission to want things. Permission not to be perfect. The girl that Emily had been wanted to be an artist, wanted to paint, wanted to create. And for 40 years, that girl had been silenced because art wasn't practical, didn't bring status, didn't satisfy the expectations of the narcissistic mother. What Emily's inner child needed wasn't an imaginary hug. It was for Emily, the adult, competent, successful woman, to finally say, "You have permission to want this. You have permission to be you." And when Emily did that, something extraordinary happened. The emptiness began to fill, not with external achievement, not with validation from other people, but with something that came from within, with the integration of a part of herself that had been exiled for decades. Emily started painting at 43, not professionally, not to earn money or recognition, just for herself, just to give a voice to that girl who had been silenced. And that's the secret that Jung discovered about healing the wounded inner child. It's not about going back in time. It's not about changing what happened. It's not about making the parents understand the damage they caused. It's about you becoming the parent that you needed. It's about you giving what you never received. But wait, because there's an even deeper part that I need to reveal. Most people try to heal the wounded inner child by keeping it separate. They talk to it, comfort it, promise to protect it. But the child continues to be treated as something separate from the adult self. Jung saw this as a fundamental mistake. The wounded inner child is not separate from you. It is you, a version of you that was frozen in time, trapped in a moment of pain that was never processed. Real integration isn't about taking care of the child. It's about merging with it. It's about allowing the needs, the desires, the emotions of that child to become part of your adult consciousness. When Emily integrated her inner child, she didn't just start painting. She started relating differently. She stopped accepting treatment she didn't deserve. She learned to say no. She discovered that she could have needs without that making her selfish or unworthy of love. Because what the narcissistic mother had taught Emily was that having needs was wrong, that needing something was weakness, that being loved depended on not needing anything. And Emily's inner child had internalized that. She had learned to hide, not to ask, not to bother. Integration meant unlearning that. It meant allowing needs to exist without shame. It meant understanding that needing love isn't weakness. It's humanity. Now, you might be wondering how to do this practically. Jung developed a step-by-step process that I'm going to explain now. It's not mystical. It's not esoteric. It's concrete psychological work that anyone can do. The first step is to identify when the complex is active. Remember when I said that the wounded inner child takes control at certain moments? The first step is to recognize those moments. They usually come accompanied by disproportionate emotional reactions. You receive a minor critique, and it feels like your world is crumbling. Someone doesn't reply to your text, and you spiral into anxiety. Your partner makes a seemingly innocuous comment, and you feel a pain in your chest that just doesn't fit the situation. These are the moments when your wounded inner child is firmly in control. Carl Jung said that the first step to integrating an autonomous complex is simply to recognize when it's active. Don't fight it. Don't try to control it. Just observe. Ah, my wounded inner child is reacting right now. This simple act of observation begins to create distance between you and the complex. You stop being the wounded inner child and start being the observer of the wounded inner child. And that shift in perspective is the beginning of integration. The second step is dialogue. Once you've identified that the wounded inner child is active, Carl Jung recommended a process of internal dialogue, not affirmations, real dialogue. You ask the child what they're feeling, and you wait for the answer. This might sound strange at first. It might even feel like you're making it up. But with practice, the answers begin to come from a source that clearly isn't your conscious mind. The child might say they're afraid of being abandoned. They might say they're angry about being ignored. They might say they're tired of pretending. And then comes the crucial part. You ask, what does the child need from you? Not what they needed from their parents. What do they need from you now? The answers might surprise you. Sometimes the child needs permission to rest. Sometimes they need protection. Sometimes they just need presence and to know that you are there, paying attention. And the third step is to take action. Internal dialogue isn't enough. The wounded inner child has learned not to trust words. They grew up hearing promises that were never kept. They need to see action. If the child said they need rest, you rest. If they said they need creativity, you create. If they said they need to stop accepting treatment they don't deserve, you start setting boundaries. Each time you act according to the needs of your inner child, you rebuild trust. You show that part of yourself that someone is finally listening, that their needs finally matter, and over time, something magical happens. The wounded inner child stops operating behind the scenes. They stop sabotaging you. They stop making you accept less, because they've finally been integrated, finally become part of your adult consciousness. Instead of an autonomous complex operating in the shadows, Emily took months to fully integrate her inner child. It wasn't a quick process. It wasn't a miraculous one-day cure. It was a daily work of listening, dialogue, and action. But the result transformed her life in ways she never thought possible. At 45 years old, Emily did something the little girl inside her had dreamed of her whole life. She left her high-powered corporate job, not to become a professional artist, but to open a space where children could paint freely, without judgment, without expectations, without having to perform to earn love. She said that every time she saw a child painting with freedom, she healed a little bit more of the girl who had been silenced within her. Now, you might be thinking that your situation is different, that your wound is deeper, that your parents were worse, or the opposite, that your childhood wasn't that bad. Let me tell you something Carl Jung noticed. After decades of treating patients, the severity of the wound doesn't depend on the severity of the trauma. There are people who suffered terrible abuse and managed to integrate those experiences, and there are people who grew up in seemingly functional families and carry deep wounds that never heal. Why? Because the damage doesn't come from the event itself. It comes from the lack of processing. It comes from the child who didn't have space to feel what they felt, who was forced to pretend that everything was okay, who learned to repress in order to survive. The child who cried and was comforted processes the damage. The child who cried and was told to stop swallows the pain. And what is swallowed doesn't disappear. It goes into the shadow. It becomes a complex. It becomes the wounded inner child. Sahu continues operating 40 years later. So it doesn't matter if your childhood was objectively bad or not. What matters is whether you had space to process what you felt. And if you're here, listening to this, you probably didn't. But here's the good news. It's never too late to do that processing. It's never too late to give a voice to the child who was silenced. It's never too late to integrate what was exiled. Carl Jung treated 80-year-old patients who did this work, and they still experienced transformation. They still found parts of themselves that they had lost decades ago. They still felt that inexplicable emptiness starting to fill. Age is not a limit to integration. Now let me reveal something that few therapists openly talk about. The work of inner child integration can be disturbing when you start giving voice to parts of yourself that have been repressed for decades. Those parts can come with intensity. The anger that was swallowed can explode. The sadness that was denied can overwhelm. The fear that was hidden can paralyze. Carl Jung warned his patients about this. He said that messing with the unconscious isn't for the faint of heart, that the forces that dwell in the shadows are powerful, precisely because they have been repressed. But he also said that this disturbance is temporary. It's necessary. It's the price of integration. And on the other side of that disturbance, there's something that most people never experience. There's authenticity. There's inner peace. That doesn't depend on external validation. There's the feeling of finally being yourself. Maybe for the first time in your life, you've just received a profound revelation about how your inner child was wounded and what they really need to heal. This isn't common information. Most videos on emotional healing repeat cliches about self-love, without ever touching the real architecture of the wound. What you heard here was the result of decades of clinical research by Carl Jung. It was the precise mapping of how autonomous complexes form and how they can be integrated. It was the difference between superficially consoling and genuinely healing. If this content made you see your own childhood differently, if some part of you recognized the wounded inner child who is still waiting, the super thanks button down there is a way to say that this truth needs to continue being shared. It's not about the amount, it's about the meaning. It's about you saying that this type of content matters, that people deserve to understand the architecture of their wounds, so they can finally heal. Each time someone lends their support, more individuals gain access to these revelations. Revelations that should be common knowledge, but are often confined to restricted academic circles. You become a part of changing that. Now, let me share the final piece. The piece that ties everything together. Jung had a theory about what happens when we integrate our autonomous complexes, including the wounded inner child. He posited that we become more whole, not perfect, whole. The difference is crucial. Perfection is the absence of flaws. It's what Emily's narcissistic mother craved. It's what the persona, as Jung defined it, attempted to project. It was the mask without cracks. Wholeness is different. It's the presence of all parts, including the imperfect parts, including the wounded inner child, including the anger, the fear, the sadness that were repressed. When you integrate the wounded inner child, you don't fix it. You accept it as part of who you are, and that acceptance transforms everything. Because the wounded inner child didn't want to be fixed. It wanted to be accepted. It wanted someone to look at it, with all its needs and vulnerabilities, and say, "You belong. You are part of me. You matter." And when you do that for yourself, something extraordinary happens. You stop seeking that acceptance outside of yourself. You stop needing other people to validate your existence. You stop entering relationships, desperate for approval, because the most important approval has already been given by you, to yourself, to all parts of you, including the parts that were rejected. Jung called this state individuation, the process of becoming an integrated individual, not perfect, whole. And that is the ultimate goal of working with the wounded inner child. It's not to make the pain disappear. It's to integrate that pain as part of your story, part of who you are, part of what made you, you. Emily never stopped feeling that pain. When she remembered her mother, the wound didn't disappear, but it stopped controlling her life. It stopped operating behind the scenes. It became a conscious part of her experience, instead of a ghost that sabotaged her. And that is healing. It's not erasing, it's integrating. Now, before we wrap up, I want to offer a concrete practice that you can start today. Jung recommended what he called dialogue with the shadow through writing. It's a simple but profoundly transformative process. You grab a piece of paper or open a blank document and you write a letter to your inner child. But it's not a letter of consolation, it's a letter of listening. You write what you imagine your inner child would say to you, if it could speak. All the angers, all the fears, all the needs that were never expressed, and then you write your response. What you, as an adult, can offer. What permissions you can give. What actions you can take. This exercise seems simple, it might even seem silly to some people, but Jung said that it's through practices like this that the unconscious finds its voice, that autonomous complexes are brought to light, that integration happens. Try it, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a real dialogue with a part of yourself that has been waiting to be heard. And when you do, pay attention to what arises. Pay attention to the emotions that appear. Pay attention to the resistances, the urges to stop, the thoughts that say, "This is ridiculous." Those resistances are signs. They are indicators that you are approaching something real, something that has been protected by decades of defenses. And on the other side of those defenses is the child who still waits, waiting for you to finally look at it, waiting for you to finally listen, waiting for you to finally say the words that your parents never did. Are you ready to do that? And if you don't know where to start, if the pain seems too great to face alone, know that this is normal. Jung said that the journey into the unconscious is the most difficult that a human being can undertake. More difficult than climbing mountains, more difficult than crossing oceans, because the territory you are exploring is your own interior, and there reside monsters that you yourself created to protect yourself. But there also reside treasures. The wounded inner child isn't just pain, it also holds your spontaneity, your creativity, your capacity to feel genuine joy, all those things that were sacrificed to build the persona, as Jung defined it. When you integrate the wounded inner child, you don't just recover peace, you recover parts of yourself that you thought you had lost forever. The ability to play, the ability to create, the ability to love without fear of abandonment, the ability to simply be without needing to prove anything. These things are waiting for you, on the other side of the pain, on the other side of the work of integration. The wounded inner child inside you knows this, and that's why it still waits, not because it is weak, but because it knows that you, finally, are strong enough to hear it. Comment below. What was a moment from your childhood that your inner child never managed to process? The moment you swallowed, that you pretended was okay, that you hid so well, that even you almost forgot. But your inner child has not forgotten. It is still waiting, and maybe it's time to finally listen to it.